Hi, I'm Richard Gross of Flexisource IT, the CEO and founder, and today I'd just like to have a bit of a chat regarding my impressions and perceptions of the difference in Australia of using in-house IT staff versus outsourcing versus staff augmentation. And to give you a little bit of a background, I moved here from New York City roughly 20-something years ago. My background used to be Wall Street. I was a fund manager. I've lived in places such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Geneva, managing equity funds. I've worked with a lot of .com startups, as well as a lot of young growth companies. I was in Japan during the first ever tech conference in Japan in 2000. So I do have a background with IT, although I'm not per se an IT person. I did quit the finance industry sometime after the GFC. Really, I found that the industry was really demotivating me. I wasn't finding the connections, and I had come to a place in my life where I was looking for a more meaningful challenge in my life. And I guess the idea for me was looking at the IT environment here in Australia. One of the areas that had always interested me is those early stage companies, and I saw the ridiculous valuations that were oftentimes given to these startup companies that were seeking funds. The VCs that were out there were taking a lot, not offering very much. And in my opinion, there was an opportunity which I saw, which was to develop some sort of an incubator for startups or early stage companies. The idea was to get that seed capital, be able to germinate those ideas and really provide value to a lot of interesting startups. So that was really my background, why I started into this industry here in Australia. And I'll give you a little bit of a summary about where that journey has taken me. So I guess the first thing was that in my role as a fund manager, I got to meet a lot of CEOs, a lot of founders of companies, both internationally and here in Australia. And particularly facing Australia, one of the common problems that I kept hearing about was the high cost of labor, the dramatic shortage of really strong IT staff. And on top of that was a changing environment, which I guess started in the late 90s of running Agile. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But really, the first thing I looked at was I wanted to understand the problem of outsourcing. Now, I was never a real big fan of outsourcing. I've seen too many instances where those horror stories of companies outsourcing their development overseas, and it came back late, it came back over budget. Oftentimes it didn't match what they were, the design had intended. I heard the stories of spaghetti code. Oftentimes I heard stories where there would be one real strong leader who knew what they were doing, and underneath them were teams of early stage or early entry-level developers who were working underneath them, all these juniors. And other things that I had heard were problems with time zone. These people were job hopping, so they had those leads, and then all of a sudden they were offered more money. They would leave, and then they were left with a bunch of juniors working underneath them that were taking over. So there were all these problems with that. Oftentimes I heard that the clients would get locked into some sort of long-term commitment. And then you had the onerous support contracts that were associated with it. And I had seen that with many of my clients as well. So, look, I've never been a big fan of taking your IT. I think your IT is more than just a product and a source. It's really the driving force behind all businesses today. So I was looking for a model where, particularly to service Australian clients, a way to do it better. And really what that led me to was traveling through Southeast Asia. I had spoken to a friend who had run teams in Malaysia. I had spoken to friends who had been involved with outsourcing to Vietnam and other places. But really what I was looking to do is, as I was starting to initiate my search, I headed to the Philippines, and that's really where I set up my first office. And the idea was to really build a service company that could provide development capabilities, that worked on the time zone. They had the communication skills, and it was very complementary to Australia. Obviously, being from the US, I was familiar that the Philippines had, in essence, been a U.S. sovereignty for nearly 100 years, up until the late 1950s. But what I really was obviously noticed is the communication skills. Everyone learns English from age 5. They had all different types of skill sets, all the different technologies. Also, they were located on roughly the same time zone. They're Perth time zone. So in essence, they always operate to Australia time zone. They had a background of being more in that business processing, which I was familiar with the BPO industry. And historically, they had worked to those U.S. hours. So I was familiar that they had, did call center to the U.S. But the idea of aligning them with Australian hours was able to attract all of the best talent. And that was one of the key areas when I went to the Philippines. And on top of that, I got to learn the culture of the people. They're very generous. Their biggest export, they don't really manufacture. Their biggest export really is their people. Today, the Philippines is the largest customer service center in the world. They've overtaken India over the past few years. So there was a real emphasis and focus for me to utilize the Philippines as a perfect resource to support Australia in their IT. I looked at the strength of them technically, and when I hit the ground in the Philippines at first, I saw a lot of the typical concerns that most congested Asian cities had come up with, and I went to the CBD, or the city center Makati, which is centered in Manila, where there's strong universities, a lot of major headquarters were there, IBM, Accenture, HP. And what this really did was they created a booming pool of technical skills. So .NET, PHP, Java, mobile developers, QAs and testers, a lot of legacy skills, a lot of new technologies now. So everything from SharePoint to ServiceNow. I've had full stack Oracle teams, new platforms coming up such as OutSystems. So I guess in the early days when I started this business, some of my early clients were companies like Melbourne IT, What If, Addcom, which is now Vocus, IINet, some of on the big end of town. And I guess it had to do with my connections from there. And the idea was, again, let's set up the service industry, and then we could start germinating those ideas towards the early stage. But again, the driving force for me was utilize these resources, build that talent pool. So what we would do is we would recruit people, we would interview, the clients would choose the people that they wanted. They would then work real time. We would use all the project management tools, Slack, Skype, Jira, Confluence, what have you. But the idea is that I didn't really believe in outsourcing. So I didn't want to do projects. I want the clients to own the outcome. Clients are in charge of architecting. They're in charge of leading their team. What we were really doing is building them collaborative teams that ran under their direction and methodology. So it wasn't individuals like a freelancer, Upwork, somebody like that. It was really the idea is building teams. And what I did find out in those early days is, look, it works, but again, communication is the key. many people will tell you that the Asian culture lacks the critical thinking, where they're used to just yesing you. And I did see some of that, particularly in the early days, where they smile and they nod that they understand, but they don't ask enough questions. There's not that sense of pushback that you would get in places like Australia and other Western countries. And from that, really where I evolved is I started hiring PMs. Much of them were from that call center BPO background, because they were able to add a lot of improvements in communication. They were able to really service the clients a lot more, but a problem was they were still unable to take those deep dives into problems. And many of the companies that we did work with didn't have those internal BAs and team leaders who were properly able to define their goals and really let us know what success is. So that was the start of it, early days, and I guess where it evolved and where I saw a lot of the involvement was, again, back in the 90s, late 90s, there was a big turn from development through waterfall or standard development into a more agile methodology. I touched base upon that before, but really quickly, I guess there was the Agile Manifesto, which I'll give you just a quick background on that. It's 12 steps or 12 rules that define agile development, and I'll just quickly read what they are. The first highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Number 2, welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for customers' competitive advantage. Deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with preference to the shorter time scale. Number 4, business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. Number 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation, and that I'll come back to as well. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. And number 12, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. So that's essentially the Agile Manifesto, and you'd see a lot of companies, and even the companies I dealt with, they were promoting a turn towards Agile. Now, they didn't necessarily know how to do that, so there were, different processes that were evoked. That is, I suppose, in the truest form, and I guess the idea is if you are all in the same room and you're able to do that, that's great. But really, from my standpoint, working the way we were, really my evolution came where we would take those technical leads that we had, or the project leads, and turn them into technical leads. So now today we use a lot of Scrum Masters, a lot of technical PMs who are either able to work with the Scrum Master to define that outcome and help define the time frame and the outcome, or else mirror the company's Scrum Master. And we'll go back to Scrum Masters as well, as that's a key point of the methodology. So understand that years ago, when I was in the investment community, there were different ways to value companies. People were looking at it as discounted cash flow models, or earnings, or EBITDA, earnings before interest, depreciation. People were using things like the PE. And I guess in the old days, not that long ago, really the CTO or the CIO would fall under the chief financial officer. So basically your IT was driven by your finance team. And if you're not a pure IT company, what you'd find is that your technology was a cost. It was an expense that the business didn't understand. There wasn't a cost-benefit analysis. So what companies used to do is they would pay somebody like Deloitte or a PwC, and they would pay them millions of dollars to come in, analyze their business, and suggest to them how to go ahead and improve their processes, usually saying something like outsourcing. And what I started to see, and you might notice it now, is companies oftentimes have what they call a chief strategy officer. Oftentimes those were people who would be the consultant or person who they hired at PwC or at one of those consulting companies, and they would hire them in-house and give them that role to basically run what they're trying to achieve. And I think that changed things a lot. So the idea being that companies want to own their own IT. They don't want to turn it over to somebody else to tell them what they need to do. They want to own the outcome in-house, and they want to drive their business, because that's where the growth is occurring. So let me go into the idea again where I touched base on the Scrum Master, and let's talk about Scrum. I guess it's one of the most popular frameworks for implementing Agile. In fact, many people today think that Scrum and Agile are the same thing, but they're not. Many frameworks can be used to implement Agile. For instance, Scrum, Kanban, but Scrum has its own unique flavor. And the biggest thing is the sprint planning. A team planning meeting. They determine basically the complete outcome in that coming sprint. So oftentimes let's say it's a 2-week sprint. The Scrum Master, along with the product owner, the head people, will decide really what they are going to achieve in that iteration. They'll do a daily stand-up. They might spend a 15-minute meeting or so with the team just to get everyone in sync. The idea is that there's a sprint, a demo, a sharing meeting where the team shows what they've accomplished at the end of that sprint. And then that retrospective where they review what they did, what went well, what didn't work, and so forth. In something like Kanban, it's usually more of a to-do list. So it's a continuous backlog of tickets to get completed, wherein that Scrum is really a process of complete iteration of getting something completed. So essentially, I guess going back to that manifesto, the big thing with which I pointed out in number 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face. And I guess in the best case scenario, everyone could be in the same room, everyone could define the outcome, and everyone's working together. But the reality here is it's not always so easy, particularly here in Australia, where there's a very competitive marketplace. Not only finding those developers and technical people, but maintaining them. The cost of upskilling, the cost of all the benefits, the equipment, the management costs. It's very difficult for a company that has developers to pay the average salary of, say, $100,000 for a developer, and then build up a team to be able to achieve that outcome. So companies now, you might find they even have, they get as much talent as they can in Melbourne, then they go ahead and recruit, and they find the same names coming up. So they might have teams in Melbourne and Sydney, or Melbourne and Brisbane, wherever it is. The idea being is you have to travel Australia to get the most talent and get the best talent for your team. So in that regard, the idea of an augmentation model, which we've been which I've been espousing, really makes sense, because if you have teams in Melbourne and then you have people in Brisbane or Perth, what's the difference if they're there or in a place like the Philippines? The difference really is the cost is significantly less, and you get a fair bit more if you could find all the right skill sets. So this is what I've learned in what I've formed for my clients is if I find the right client, which is a client who treats the people in the Philippines, my team, as the same way as you would treat your own team. So the client, they are the product owner. So they are the key stakeholder of the team. They're the ones with the vision. They build upon what they want to convey as the vision to the team. They write the user stories. Now they provide a high-level definition of the requirements, containing all the information necessary for a developer to within a reasonable estimate, reproduce that and be able to implement it. So, and then we run sprints. So you allow the development process to provide tangible results in line with that scoping. So an ideal iteration, like I said, might be 2 to 3 weeks. There might be a sprint planning with the Scrum Master, the product owner, the whole team involved. There's pushback, so they don't necessarily just yes you and say the product owner says this is what's to be done. They go back and forth to discuss what can be achieved in that limited time frame. The idea as well to maintain the integrity of that is in the midst of that sprint, the product owner shouldn't be coming back with, and I want to add this or that. The idea is let's get that piece done, and then all of those new requirements, the bugs and so forth, can be added to the next sprint. And then again, following it is that retrospective. So at the completion of the sprint, all parties involved are going to sit down. We're going to discuss how to get things done, what worked, what didn't work, and then evaluate what's the next goal to get accomplished in the next sprint. So that's what I've seen from my background in terms of the problem with running, with outsourcing, how best to go ahead and do an augmentation model. And then I guess the idea is, yes, it would be great if you could go in-house, if you could afford the costs, if you could find the talent, if you could keep everyone together in that one room and run that Agile Scrum methodology. It's a great way to go, if possible. But realistically, in today's environment here in Australia, an augmented version of it allows you all of that same benefits, and you get a lot more because you basically have your own dedicated team that can grow, and you could build much more effectively. So I guess going back to my initial goal of building and germinating those incubators and startups, look, the VC market over the past 10 years or so has really matured. Valuations now are fairly reasonable. There's a lot of competition to secure, fund and nurture ideas. You're seeing a lot of the incubators, a lot of startup groups, a lot of co-working spaces. So that idea, I guess, which I originally came up with, has somewhat changed. I'm continually working with my team to teach them and encourage them innovation. We have weekly brown bag sessions. We're building in-house products. We're partnering with startups to build both proof of concepts as well as accelerate young developing businesses. And the proof of concepts and that early stage is a great way to run in Scrum if those companies, again, can be the product owner, can build user stories. So the idea, again, is I'm looking to build a diverse suite of clients who share that roadmap, who know how to work cooperatively, so we're still growing. We've expanded in the startup community, so I volunteer oftentimes with a group called Silicon Beach Oz, which has about 10,000 members. It's really just bringing entrepreneurs, startups, people with ideas, basically encouraging people to vocalize, to put out their ideas to other people who will encourage them and help build that collaboration. We're actually just about to launch our own events. So Silicon Beach Manila is a collaboration between those entrepreneurs, founders, and businesses in the Philippines. It's to mirror the work that the Australian enterprise has done and perhaps build relationships between both countries. I'm exploring various partnerships, joint ventures around innovation labs, and more importantly, we're building a community through outreach programs, social awareness, and really building a collaborative space where we've built a family. So when my wife jokes to me about my, your Philippine family, she's talking about my 100 or so people in Manila who we look after, who are part of the team that share in the profits of any startup that we do together, and to work collaboratively with Australian companies, individuals, and people to really create their own their dreams. So for me, this exercise has been, I guess it's been a justification for me of walking away from a successful business that I wasn't enjoying, and to try to create an environment where you feel a sense of value and can leave a mark with people, individuals, businesses that make you feel good about what you're doing. And Flexisource IT is that for me. I encourage anyone who wants to know more about the startup community, how to run Agile, Scrum, or Kanban with offshore teams, and anyone who wants to know more about the talent pool, the people, and the way to operate offshore, to reach out to me. I thank everyone for listening to this, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you all. Bye now.